Mechanics of the pulmonary ventilation. Muscles that cause lung expansion and contraction. The lung can be expanded and contracted in two ways. First, by the downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen or to shorten the chest cavity. Second, by elevation and depression of the ribs to increase and decrease the anterior posterior diameter of the chest cavity using the intercostal muscles. Normal and quiet breathing is accomplished almost entirely by the first method, that is by the movement of the diaphragm. During the inspiration, constriction of the diaphragm pulls the lower surface of the lungs downward. Then during expiration, the diaphragm simply relaxes and the elastic recoil of the lungs, chest wall, and abdominal structures compresses the lungs to expel the air. During heavy breathing, however, the elastic forces are not powerful enough to cause the necessary rapid expiration. So, extra force is achieved mainly by the contraction of the abdominal muscles, which pushes the abdominal content upward against the bottom of the diaphragm, thereby compressing the lungs. The second method for expanding the lungs is to raise the rib cage. Raising the rib cage expand the lungs because in the natural resting position the ribs slant downward, thus allowing the sternum to fall backward towards the vertebral column. When the rib cage is elevated, however, the ribs project almost directly forward, so the sternum also moves forward away from the spine, making the anteroposterior thickness of the chest about 20% greater during the maximum inspiration than during expiration. Therefore, all the muscles that elevate the chest cage are classified as the muscles of inspiration, and the muscles that depresses the chest cage are classified as muscles of expiration. Expiration. The most important muscles that raise the rib cage are external intercostals, but others that help are the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which lift upward on the sternum, anterior serratii, which lift many of the ribs, and scaleni, which lift the first two ribs, and alveoli, which cause flaring of the nostrils, which can be seen by few diagrams. This is the diagram explain the contraction expansion of the thoracic cages during the expiration and during this inspiration. These are the ribs, and these ribs, in between the ribs there is association of the muscles in a cross section. Here is abdominal contraction, and next figure of the inspiration, because the inspiration is an active process during which contraction of the muscles increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. Elevated in the rib cage during this process, first this line express the increased vertical diameter. For increasing the vertical diameter, the external cage, elevated rib cage is downward located, so it is elevated towards the upside. Second, the increase anteroposterior diameter. For increasing anteroposterior diameter, the thoracic cavity is elevated somewhat forward in direction. So this diagram, this one expresses this one, sorry, from brush. This one, this axis is increased antero-posterior diameter of the thoracic cavity due to the elevation of the rib cage. External intercostal contracted and internal intercostal relax. During the period of inspiration, external intercostal muscles contracted whereas internal intercostal muscles relax. At the same time, at the lower position, there is a location of the diaphragm. Diaphragm is also constructed by the radial muscles. During the expiration, it remains in a dome-shaped position. So, during inspiration, it becomes somewhat flattened like this. So it says the muscles that pull the rib cage downward during the expiration are mainly. Expiration is executed by the contraction of abdominal recti muscles, which have powerful effect on pulling downward on the lower ribs at the same time that these and other abdominal muscles also compresses the abdominal content upward against the diaphragm and the internal intercostal muscles. We comes to this point, this is the expiration, and during this expiration there are two muscles. One is abdominal recti and second one is internal intercostal. These two muscles are contracted during the expiration. The air present in the lungs expelled out through the nostril. This figure also shows the mechanism by which the external and internal costal muscles act to cause inspiration and expiration. To the left, the ribs during the expiration are angled downward and the external intercostals are elongated forward and downward. As they contract, they pull the upper ribs forward in relation to the lower ribs, which causes leverage on the ribs to raise them upward, thereby causing inspiration. The internal intercostal functions exactly in the opposite manner, functioning as excretory muscles because they angle between the ribs in the opposite direction and cause opposite leverage. The action of the intercostal muscles during inspiration and expiration are shown in next few diagram also. So we can go through the next slide. This slide represents the location of the external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles between the ribs. These are the ribs and these one are external intercostal muscles. These external intercostal muscles showing upward and anterior. Upward and anterior increase the volume of thoracic cavity, whereas these are the ribs and this is internal intercostal muscles. During the contraction, they show downward and posterior. So the reduction of the volume of the thoracic cavity takes place. Pressure that cause the movement of the air in and out of the lungs. The lungs is an elastic structure that collapses like a balloon and expels all its air through the trachea whenever there is no force. To keep it inflated, Also, there are also attachment between the lungs and the walls of the chest cage expel where it is suspended at its helium from the mid-diasternum. The middle section of the chest cavity. Instead, the lung float in the thoracic cavity surrounded by a thin layer of pleural plate that lubricates movement of the lungs within the cavity. Further, continued suction to access the fluid into the lymphatic channels maintain a slight suction between the visceral and surface of the lungs pleura and parietal pleural surface of the thoracic cavity. Therefore, the lungs are held to thoracic wall as if glued there, except that they are well lubricated and can slide freely as chest expands and contract. Now we comes to the pleural pressure. This slide explains the muscles acting during the inspiration and expiration. As we know, inspiration is an active process which involves the radial muscles of the diaphragm as well as external intercostal muscles of the ribs undergoes contraction. Along with it, there are few accessory inspiratory muscles which also contract during the inspiration are sternocleidomastoid muscles, anterior serrative muscles, scalenii muscles, and alveoli muscles. And the expiration is a passive process. But when thoracic cavity, a cage of the ribs, undergoes or achieve its previous position of the reduced volume, there are contraction of the muscles takes place. These muscles are rectus abdominis, internal intercostal muscles, internal and external oblique muscles, and transverse abdominis. These are the few events during the expiration and inspiration which has been explained after knowing the pleural pressure and its changes during the respiration. Pleural pressure is the pressure of the fluid in the thin space between the lung pleura and the chest wall pleura. As noted earlier, this pressure is normally a slight suction, which means a slightly negative pressure. The normal pleural pressure at the beginning of the inspiration is about minus 5 centimeter H2O, which is the amount of the suction required to hold the lungs open to their resting level during normal inspiration. Expansion of the chest cage pulls the outward on the lungs and greater force and create more negative pressure, so an average of about minus 7.5 cm H2O. These relationship between the pleural pressure and changing lung volume are demonstrated in next figure. This figure. Changes in the lung volume during the inspiration and expiration. Alveolar pressure, again we comes to this point. The air pressure inside the lung alveoli is a alveolar pressure. Alveolar pressure is the pressure inside the lung alveoli. When glottis is open, no air is flowing into or out of the lungs. The pressure in all parts of the respiratory traces all the ways to the alveoli are equal to the atmosphere pressure, which is considered to be zero reference pressure in the airways. That is 0 centimeter H2O pressure. This is 0 centimeter pressure. This 0. To cause inward flow of the air into the alveoli during the inspiration, the pressure in the alveoli must fall to a value slightly below the atmospheric pressure, which is 0. The second curve labeled alveolar pressure. This second one, alveolar pressure. This demonstrates that during the normal inspiration, alveolar pressure decreases to about minus 1 cm H2O. This slight negative pressure is enough to pull 0.5 liter of air into the lungs in 2 seconds required for normal quiet inspiration. What we are saying that the alveolar pressure equal to atmospheric pressure is 0. But a slight reduce in the a slight reduce in the pressure, which is become minus 1. This minus 1 cmH2O pressure is responsible for inhalation of 0.5 liter air into the lungs within the 2 seconds during the quiet normal breath. During expiration, alveolar pressure rise to about plus 1. This time, this is an increase, this is minus 1 and this is plus 1. When plus 1 cm H2O pressure is achieved, the enough forces applied on the lungs to expel out 0.5 milliliter of air from lungs to the atmosphere within 2 to 3 seconds. Transpulmonary pressure. Transpulmonary pressure is the difference between the alveolar and pleural pressures. This figure represents, this one is a transpulmonary pressure, which is difference between the alveolar pressure and pleural pressure. That transpulmonary pressure is the pressure difference between that is in the alveoli and that on the surface, outer surface of the lungs, pleural pressure. And it is a measure of the elastic forces in the lungs that tend to collapse the lungs at each instant of respiration, called the recoil pressure. This is the recoiling pressure. Now we comes to the compliance of the lungs. The extent to which the lungs will expand for each unit increases in the transpulmonary pressure. If enough time is allowed to reach the equilibrium, is called the lung compliance. The total compliance of the both lungs together in the normal adult human average about 200 ml of the air per centimeter of water transpulmonary pressure. This is every time the transpulmonary pressure increases 1 centimeter H2O. The lung volumes after 10 to 20 seconds will expel 200 ml. Compliance diagram of the lungs. This one is the compliance diagram of the lungs. This figure explains and relating this diagram to the lung volume change to change in the pleural pressure, which in turn alters the transpulmonary pressure. Note that the relation is different for inspiration and expiration. Each curve is recorded by changing the pleural pressure in a small steps and allowing the lung volume to come to a steady level between successive steps. The two curves are called respectively inspiratory compliance curve, and expiratory compliance curve, and the entire diagram is called compliance diagram of the lungs. The characteristics of the compliance diagram are determined by the elastic forces of the lungs. These forces can be divided into two parts. First, elastic forces of the lung tissue. Elastic forces caused by the surface tension of the fluid that lines the inside wall of the alveoli and other lung air spaces. The elastic forces of the lung tissues are determined mainly by elastin and collagen fiber interwoven among the lung parenchyma. In deflected lungs, these fibers are in the elastically contracted and kicked state. Then when the lungs expand, the fibers become stressed and unkicked, thereby elongating and exerting even more elastic forces. The elastic forces caused by the surface tension are much more complex. The significance of surface tension is shown in next diagram, which compares the compliance diagram of the lungs when filled with the saline solution and filled with the air when the lungs are filled with air. There is an interface between the alveolar fluid and the air in the alveoli. In the lung filled with the saline solution, the lung filled with the saline solution, there is no air fluid interfaces, and therefore the surface tension effect is not present. Only tissue elastic forces are operative in the lungs filled with saline solution. Note the transpleural pressure required to expel air-filled lungs are about 3 times as high as those required to expand lungs filled with this saline solution. Thus, one can conclude that the tissue elastic forces tending to cause collapse of the air-filled lungs represent only about 1/3 of the total lung elasticity, whereas the fluid air surface tension forces in the alveoli represent about 2/3. The fluid air surface tension elastic forces of the lungs also increase tremendous when the substance called surfactant is not present in the alveolar fluid. Regional variation of the compliance and effect of gravity. The basal region of the lungs are gravity dependent and receive more ventilation as compared to upper region of the lungs. The basal region of the lungs have less negative intrapleural pressure as compared to the upper region of the lungs due to the gravity and the weight of the lungs. The results in the upper region alveoli having larger volumes as compared to those in the basal and more dependent regions. The alveoli in the upper regions are already filled with the air and are less compliant compared to those in the dependent region, which are more compliant and are able to increase their volume with each breath. Surfactant, surface tension, and collapse of alveoli. First, we go through the principle of the surface tension. When water forms a surface with the air, the water molecules on the surface of the water have an especially strong attraction for one another. As a result, the water surface is always attempting to contract. This is what holds the raindrop together. A tight contractile membrane of the water molecule around the entire surface of the raindrop. Now let us receive this principle and see what happens on the inner surface of the alveoli. Here, the water surface is also attempting to contract. This tends to force air out of the alveoli through the bronchi, and in doing so, cause the alveoli to try to collapse. The net effect is to cause an elastic contractile force of the entire lung, which is called the surface tension elastic force. Surfactant and its effects on the surface tension. Surfactant is the surface active agent in water. This is surface active agent in water, which means that it greatly reduces the surface tension of the water. It is secreted by the special surfactant secreting epithelial cells called type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, which constitute about 10% of the surface area of the alveoli. These cells are glandular, containing lipid inclusions that are secreted in the surfactant into the alveoli. Surfactant is a complex mixture of several phospholipid proteins and ions. The most important components are the phospholipid dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine, surfactant, apoproteins, and calcium ions. The dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine and several less important phospholipids are responsible for the producing the surface tension. They perform this function by not dissolving uniformity in the fluid lining the alveolar surface. Indeed, part of the molecular dissolves while the remainder spread over the surface of the water in the alveoli. This surface has from 1/12 to 1/2 the surface tension of the pure water surface. In the quantitative norms, the surface tension is the different water fluids is approximately the following. Pure water having 72 dynes per centimeter, normal fluids lining the alveoli but without the surfactants 50 dynes per centimeter. Normal fluids lining the alveoli and with the normal amount of surfactant included between 5 to 30 dynes per centimeter. Pressure is occluded alveoli caused by surface tension. If the air pressure leading from the alveoli to the lungs and blocked the surface tension in the alveoli tends to collapse the alveoli. The collapse creates positive pressure in the alveoli attempting to push the air out. The amount of pressure generated in this way in an alveolus can be calculated using Lapa'S Law, which describes the relationship between the surface tension T and radius of the alveoli R and the pressure P from the following formulas. Pressure is equal to 2 is multiplied by the surface tension upon the radius of the alveolus. For the average size alveolus with a radius of about 100 micrometer and lined with normal surfactant, this calculates to be about 4 cm H2O pressure, which is 3 mmHg. If the alveoli were lined with the pure water without any surfactant, the pressure would be calculated to be about 18 cm H2O pressure, which is 4.5 times lighter. Thus, one has the importance of the surfactants in the reducing alveolar surface tension and therefore also reducing the efforts required by the respiratory muscles to expand the lungs. Effect of alveolar radius and pressure caused by surfactant. The preceding formula, that are the pressure generates as a result of surface tension in the alveoli, is inversely affected by the radius of the alveolus, which means that the smaller the alveolus, the greater is the alveolar pressure caused by the surface tension. Thus, when the alveoli have half the normal radius, 50 instead of 100 micrometer, the pressure noted earlier are doubled. To summarize this, we can see here in this slide, this is the alveolus without surfactant. Surface tension in the both alveolus is same. A greater pressure is required to keep small alveolus open, and small alveolus tend to empty into a larger one. There is a greater pressure required to small alveolus open. This is the small open. To open it, there is requirement of a pressure which leads into the air present in the small alveolus, and this air is poured into the greater alveolus. The thickness of the green circle indicates surface tension and red arrow indicates the pressure. And this is the Lapa'S Law again. P is equal to 2T upon R. These are the alveolus with surfactant. Surface tension reduced in the small alveoli. The pressure distensible both the alveoli is approximately the same. Alveoli are stabilized and the tendency for the small alveoli to empty into the larger one is reduced. So the air remains into both of the alveoli. But effect of the thoracic case on the lungs expandability. Thus far we have discussed the expandability of the lungs alone without considering the thoracic case. The thoracic case has its own elastic and viscous characteristics similar to those of the lungs. Even if the lungs were not present in the thorax, muscular effect would still be required to expand the thoracic cage. Compliance of the thorax and lungs together, the compliance of the entire pulmonary system, the lung and the thoracic cage together, is measured while expanding the lungs of a totally relaxed or paralyzed subject. To measure compliance, air is forced into the lungs a little at a time while recording lung pressure and volumes to inflate this total pulmonary system almost twice as much pressure as is required to inflate the same. Lungs are removable from the chest cage is necessary. Therefore, the compliance of the combined lung thorax system is almost exactly one half that of the lung alone. 110 ml of the volume per centimeter of the water pressure for the combined system compared with 200 ml of the per centimeter for the lung alone. Furthermore, when the lungs are expanded to high volume or compressed as low volumes, the limitation of the chest become extreme. When near these limits, the compliance of the combined lung thorax system can be less than one-fifth that of the lungs alone, and the condition is increased or decreased compliance work of breathing. We have already pointed out that during normal and quiet breathing, all the respiratory muscles contraction occurs during the inspiration, and expiration is almost entirely a passive process caused by the elastic recoil of the lungs and chest case. Thus, under resting condition, the respiratory muscles normally perform work to cause inspiration but not to cause expiration. The work of inspiration can be divided into three fractions. First, that required to expand the lungs against the lung and chest. Elastic forces called compliance work of elastic work. That required to overcome from the viscosity of the lung and chest wall structure called tissue resistance work. Third, the required to overcome airway resistance to movement of the air into the lungs called airway resistance work. This compare work of the breathing in normal individual with obstructive and decrease in restrictive disease. Energy required for respiration. During normal and quiet respiration, on 3 to 5% of the total energy expended by the body is required for the pulmonary ventilation. However, during heavy exercise, the amount of energy required can increase as much as 50-fold. Especially if the person has any degree of the increased airway resistance or decreased pulmonary compliance. Therefore, one of the major limitations on the intensibility of exercise that can be performed is the person's ability to provide enough muscles energy for the respiratory process alone. अब आ रहे हो क्या तो चला There are few factors which are determining the lung compliance are the elastic forces of the lung tissue, elastic power interwoven in the lungs parenchyma, collagen fiber woven in lung parenchyma, elastic forces inside wall of the alveoli, surface tension of the fluid that lines the inside wall of the alveoli. Surfactant help reduce the surface tension. and these are the pulmonary surfactant. Surfactant is a complex mixture of several phospholipid proteins and ions. It contains dipalmitoyl phosphatidylcholine. It is responsible for reducing the surface tension within the alveoli, and it is produced by the type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. These are the few points remember for us. This is all about the mechanism of the respiration. At the end, we go for the assignment. Explain the mechanism of respiration, how inspiration and expiration takes place, and which are the muscles involved during this process of respiration has to be explained under the answer of this question. Second, the write down the events during the expiration and inspiration. So this topic has been left by us, but in a summarized way we have one slide to explain it once. So we go to that slide and explain what are the events responsible for the expiration and inspiration. First, we go through the inspiration because inspiration is important and inspiration is an active process. So the respiratory center initiates the stimuli for the inspiration. These impulses are carried by nerves to the inspiratory muscles. The diaphragm and the other inspiratory muscles contracted. The chest wall expand, increasing the volume of the thorax. The intrapleural pressure becomes more negative. The alveolar pressure decreases below the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli initiates an air inflow into them until the alveolar pressure reaches the atmospheric pressure. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, these are the 7 events are responsible for the inspiration. For the expiration, respiratory center terminates the stimulus for the inspiratory impulses. The diaphragm and the inspiratory muscles relaxed. Chest wall retracts and decreases the volume of the thorax. The interpleural pressure becomes less negative. The alveolar pressure above the atmospheric pressure. The alveoli undergo elastic recoil, forcing air out, and the alveoli deflates the airflow out until the alveolar pressure reaches to the atmospheric pressure. These are the few events has been taken place during the inspiration and expiration. So these events are explained in front of you by the slides. And last question, write down the name of the muscles acting during the expiration and inspiration. For the answer of this question, there is one more slide which has been already explained by us, but we can again show the name of these muscles involved in inspiration and expiration. During the inspiration, there is a contraction of the radial muscles in the diaphragm, external intercostal muscles. There are few accessory inspiratory muscles are also involved during the process of inspirations are sternocleidomastoid muscles, anterior serrative muscles, and scleni muscles and alveoli muscles. The muscles responsible for the expiration are rectus abdominis, internal intercostal muscles, internal and external oblique muscles, and transverse abdominis. These are the questions of this few questions have been presented before you for the assignment. And at the last but not least, thank you for watching this video. We thank be thankful to you for watching this video and hope that this video becomes useful and added information in your bright knowledge of mechanism of the respiration. Thank you once again.